There is a defining, terrifying threshold where the fierce ambition that built your entire reality suddenly goes completely cold. You look at the massive goals that used to keep you awake with excitement, and your physical body registers absolutely nothing but a hollow, echoing void. You observe the people around you hustling furiously through their days, consumed by the secret fear that your inner fire has permanently burned out and you have lost your competitive edge forever. This is not a defect, and you are absolutely not falling behind. The sudden, crushing apathy you feel is not a symptom of depression. It is the exact, measurable instant your biology initiates a deliberate power outage on your former identity. Your central nervous system is forcefully plunging your physical vessel into a localized energetic blackout, abruptly severing the electrical supply to the exhausted, trauma-bound circuits of who you used to be. Your biology is actively halting your forward momentum to prepare your physical architecture for a staggering quantum reorganization. Your hardware is shutting down the old simulation. If your internal engine just flatlined and you can no longer force yourself to chase the old outcomes, type "I surrender the old timeline" in the comments below. The physical motion of externalizing this release sends a massive wave of coherent safety to your vagus nerve, signaling that the profound cellular upgrade can officially begin. You open your eyes in the morning, and before you even have the chance to consciously register the pale, quiet light filtering through your bedroom window, you feel the crushing, undeniable weight. A profound, unnatural, and deeply physical gravity is aggressively pulling the very bones of your body deep into the dense fabric of the mattress. It absolutely does not matter if you have just slept for 8, 9, or even 12 completely uninterrupted hours in a dark room. You wake up carrying a devastating, ancient, and cellular exhaustion that mere physical rest simply cannot touch, negotiate with, or alleviate in any way. You slowly drag your heavy gaze over to your daily to-do list, staring blankly at the exact same tasks, complex obligations, and grand, sprawling goals that used to instantly ignite a furious, burning fire of urgency in the center of your chest. But today, right now, in this specific moment of your existence, there is absolutely zero physiological response. The biological ignition switch is completely shattered, and the familiar engine will not turn over no matter how hard, how desperately, or how furiously you try to turn the key. You feel a thick, suffocating, and almost tactile fog settling permanently right behind your eyes, an absolute cognitive density that makes every single micro-movement feel like you are desperately wading through a waist-deep, freezing river of dark, heavy molasses. You watch everyone else around you actively sprinting, blindly hustling, and effortlessly moving through the trivial, repetitive motions of their daily lives with a sickening amount of energy. As you witness their frantic pace, a quiet, terrifying, and deeply isolating panic begins to echo in the hollow, empty chambers of your mind. You secretly and painfully wonder if you have permanently lost your drive, if your once celebrated ambition has simply evaporated into thin air, or if you are quietly, invisibly slipping into a deep, irreversible state of psychological and emotional regression. You are not regressing, you are not failing, and your mind is absolutely not broken. What you are physically experiencing in your vessel right now is a deliberate, highly sophisticated, and incredibly ancient biological mechanism of profound transformation. This systemic heaviness, this complete inability to move with your usual aggressive speed, is a direct, calculated, and intentional physiological redirection of your core bioelectric energy. Your body is actively, aggressively, and unapologetically pulling vital electrical power away from the prefrontal cortex and the external sensory processing areas of your physical brain. It is rapidly funneling massive, unprecedented, and staggering amounts of cellular ATP directly toward the deep, unseen foundational structures of your central nervous system for a complete and total architectural reorganization. Your complex biological system is initiating a highly deliberate state of localized entropy. It is intentionally, systematically, and ruthlessly starving the deeply established, high-energy neuro pathways that continuously maintain the rigid, exhausting, and limiting timeline of your past identity. The complex interwoven neurological framework of exactly who you used to be requires an immense, almost unfathomable amount of daily metabolic energy just to sustain its fragile shape in the physical world. Your higher system has simply and decisively decided to abruptly cut the main power lines to those outdated, inefficient grids. The rigid, predictable and deeply conditioned mathematical structures of your old behavioral loops are being forced into a state of active, accelerated and irreversible decay. You feel undeniably heavy, remarkably slow, and profoundly exhausted because the immense vital energy required to constantly project your artificial, survival-based personality into the external world has been completely hijacked for a massive internal reconstruction project. It is exactly and literally like a high-powered, sophisticated smartphone completely freezing its glowing screen and blatantly ignoring all of your frantic, desperate, and rapid fire taps. You can press your frustrated fingers against the smooth glass all you want. You can panic about the sudden unresponsiveness of the digital interface, but the complex device will absolutely not obey your external commands. 99% of its foundational processing power is currently being aggressively consumed by a massive, unskippable, and fundamentally critical core operating system update happening deep in the unseen, inaccessible background of the motherboard. The frustrating, paralyzing external freeze is simply the mandatory, entirely necessary byproduct of a profound and irreversible internal upgrade of your base code. And as this invisible, deeply cellular upgrade actively takes hold of your biology, the very fabric of the physical world around you begins to drastically and unnervingly alter its texture, its depth, and its density. You find yourself sitting quietly in a crowded room, intimately surrounded by friends, family, or colleagues you have known and interacted with for years. Or perhaps you are simply walking down a busy, familiar street in an environment you have mindlessly navigated 1,000 times before. But suddenly, without any logical warning or external trigger, everything in your entire field of vision feels slightly two-dimensional, profoundly flat, and entirely devoid of its usual engaging depth. You look across the living room, and it feels exactly as though a thick, impenetrable, entirely invisible pane of cold, heavy glass has been violently dropped between your physical body and the rest of the breathing, moving world. The animated, seemingly important conversations happening directly around you sound incredibly muffled, distorted, distant, and completely inconsequential to your current state of vibrating being. You constantly catch yourself staring blankly into empty, negative space, entirely and blissfully detached from the predictable social dynamics, the hidden agendas, and the petty, repetitive, exhausting drama that used to pull you in so effortlessly and completely. You feel exactly like a foreign entity, a quiet alien trapped in a strange biological vessel, passively spectating your own daily routine from a great, insurmountable distance, rather than actually participating in the chaotic pulse of the living, breathing world. This deeply unsettling, ghostly detachment is not a psychological failure, a chemical imbalance, or a symptom of clinical depression. It is a highly calculated, flawlessly executed neurological decoupling protocol. Your brain is actively, deliberately, and forcefully separating your conscious, witnessing awareness from the dense, noisy machinery of the default mode network. This specific, highly energy-hungry region of the human brain is entirely responsible for generating and maintaining the continuous, exhausting, and often painful narrative of your fragile ego and your limiting historical identity. By artificially dampening the electrical synaptic firing in these highly specific, deeply conditioned neural regions, your autonomous nervous system is effectively creating a mandatory, highly protective, dissociative buffer zone. It is hitting the master pause button on your mind's constant, frantic, and desperate generation of artificial meaning, historical context, and deep emotional attachment to external, uncontrollable outcomes. This expansive buffer zone is a sterile, heavily protected, and utterly silent internal environment. Your physical brain absolutely requires this complete, undisturbed, and profound silence so that it can precisely and surgically untangle decades of deeply embedded emotional conditioning without the constant, noisy, and chaotic interference of your daily overwhelming reality. It is actively and aggressively breaking the dense, calcified synaptic bonds of your traumatic, limiting past. It simply cannot perform that incredibly delicate, life-altering microscopic surgery while you are actively participating in the noisy, distracting illusion of your current, collapsing environment. Think of a packed, incredibly noisy, and emotionally engaged movie theater where the heavy, spinning projector reel suddenly and violently slips off its mechanical tracks. The captivated, a deeply invested audience is abruptly left sitting in the pitch-black dark, staring in absolute, stunned and confused silence at a massive, blank, brilliantly illuminated white screen. The immersive, gripping illusion of the cinematic world has completely and instantaneously collapsed. But high up in the dark, hidden and inaccessible projection booth, the master projectionist is frantically, precisely and expertly threading an entirely new, unreleased and breathtaking film into the complex, interlocking gears of the heavy machinery. You are not losing your mind, you are not detaching from reality, and you are not broken. You are simply sitting patiently, quietly, and heavily in the pure, transitional, unblemished light that exists only in the terrifying, beautiful space between the definitive end of your old, exhausted story and the sudden, explosive, and miraculous beginning of your entirely new reality. As the heavy velvet curtains permanently close on your old, tired narrative, the very foundation of your future starts to feel terrifyingly empty, profoundly dark, and utterly blank. The grand, overarching goals, the highly specific, detailed ambitions, and the relentless, grinding, agonizing hustle that entirely defined your outward, public personality for the last few years suddenly seem entirely, fundamentally, and laughably pointless. You look out at the distant, glittering finish lines you were desperately, breathlessly, and painfully running toward, and they evoke absolutely nothing within the quiet space of your heart. This sudden, undeniable realization leaves a vast, echoing and terrifying void exactly where your core, driving, desperate motivation used to burn so fiercely and brightly. You try your absolute hardest, with every ounce of your remaining willpower, to force yourself to care deeply about the outcomes you have been aggressively chasing for so long. You desperately try to artificially manufacture the familiar, comforting anxiety. You try to summon the old, reliable, burning urgency to violently push you forward. But the emotional engine has simply stalled completely, definitively and permanently. A very quiet, highly insidious, and deeply conditioned voice in the back of your exhausted head whispers cruel lies, telling you that you are giving up, that you are a miserable failure, that you have permanently lost your competitive edge and your rightful place in the social hierarchy. You feel a deep, highly uncomfortable, and utterly cavernous emptiness expanding within your chest. It is a vast, terrifying internal landscape, entirely devoid of both the intoxicating, exhilarating, addictive highs of material success and the crushing, devastating, paralyzing lows of public failure. You are inexplicably and hopelessly suspended in a profound, unmoving state of absolute, unnerving neutrality. You are floating aimlessly, weightlessly, without a reliable compass, a drawn map, or a guiding star to follow. This terrifying, expansive void is not a tragic symptom of a broken, defeated spirit. It is the direct, physical, and undeniable manifestation of your delicate, complex neurochemistry undergoing a massive, systemic, and permanent dopamine baseline reset. For years, decades even, your physical body has been running dangerously close to the absolute red line, fueled entirely by the toxic, volatile, and highly corrosive fumes of survival-based adrenaline and stress-induced desperate achievement. Your higher biological and energetic system is now intentionally, purposefully, and forcefully down-regulating the specific, deeply burnt-out chemical receptor sites that were hopelessly biochemically addicted to that chaotic, erratic, and painful survivalist frequency. In the complex, beautiful mathematical realm of advanced chaos theory, this specific undeniable phenomenon is known directly as the profound dissolution of a strange attractor. The powerful, invisible, and deeply restrictive energetic pull of your old, repetitive, and destructive behavioral orbit has weakened to the absolute, undeniable point of structural mathematical collapse. You are no longer mathematically, physically, or energetically bound to the heavy, suffocating gravitational pull of your previous identity or your painfully constructed historical limitations. This sudden, total collapse naturally and biologically causes a temporary, profound, and terrifying flatline in your overall systemic neurotransmitter activity. The old familiar neurochemical rewards simply do not work anymore because the outdated receptors have been permanently shut down and dismantled. But the new, higher frequency, deeply resonant attractant has not yet fully formed, materialized, and stabilized in the wet physical tissue of your brain. You are drifting silently, weightlessly, and completely alone in the dark. Zero gravity, infinite space between two entirely different, deeply separated dimensions of consciousness and biological reality. It deeply, viscerally, and perfectly resembles a massive, incredibly powerful, high-speed bullet train that has suddenly and intentionally cut its screaming electric engines completely. The massive, incredibly heavy metal machine is gliding in absolute, eerie, and unnatural silence along the cold, unyielding steel tracks, resting perfectly and smoothly in neutral gear. It is intentionally, purposefully bleeding off its aggressive, unstoppable, and dangerous forward momentum. It is not fundamentally broken. The skilled conductor has not fallen asleep at the wheel, and it certainly has not violently derailed into a tragic disaster. It is simply slowing down entirely, conserving every single ounce of its remaining kinetic energy, so that the complex, interconnected mechanical tracks miles ahead can safely, precisely, and flawlessly shift in the absolute darkness. It is calmly, quietly, and perfectly preparing to gracefully and flawlessly divert millions of tons of forward-moving steel onto an entirely different, previously inaccessible, and infinitely more beautiful and expansive rail network. Without any logical external trigger, and without a single crisis occurring in your immediate physical environment, you suddenly experience crushing waves of intense, suffocating internal pressure. It is a phantom anxiety that possesses no specific cause, anchors to no tangible target, and carries absolutely no coherent narrative. You might simply be sitting silently in your car, staring blankly out a window at a completely mundane scene, and suddenly your chest feels impossibly, unbearably tight. It feels as though an invisible leaden weight is steadily compressing your sternum, restricting your breath, and forcing your heart to hammer against your ribs in a desperate rhythm of unprovoked panic. In these overwhelming moments, you experience sudden, violent flashes of old, discarded memories that you genuinely believed were fully processed. You are subjected to a rapid-fire, inescapable slideshow of past embarrassments, stinging social rejections, or random, intensely localized grief for people and situations that have not crossed your mind in a decade. These emotional fragments bubble up to the very surface of your conscious awareness, burning brightly with their raw intensity, and then vanish into the ether just as quickly as they materialized. Your physical body feels entirely alien to you during these episodes, behaving exactly like a sealed, heavy iron pressure cooker that has been negligently left on the highest possible heat setting. You are vibrating internally with an unexplainable, deeply uncomfortable energetic frequency, a low hum of biological terror that leaves you feeling incredibly raw, profoundly overexposed, and terrifyingly vulnerable to the absolute slightest external sensory stimulus. You must understand with absolute certainty that this is not a psychological breakdown, nor is it a sudden onset of unmanageable clinical panic that requires urgent medical pathologization. This is the exact, measurable, and entirely necessary moment your central nervous system violently enters the bifurcation point, a recognized and highly documented state of maximum mathematical instability within any complex, evolving biological network. The rigid, deeply calcified algorithms of your past identity, the heavily ingrained neurological loops that have strictly dictated your survival mechanisms for decades, are now beginning to completely and irreversibly shatter under the immense, unyielding pressure of new high-frequency energetic input. The terrifying emotional turbulence you are currently experiencing, the sudden spikes in your resting heart rate, and the phantom waves of ancient grief are not malfunctions. They are the literal physical and highly localized friction of millions of established dense neural pathways violently breaking apart simultaneously within the physical tissue of your brain. Your biological system is aggressively dismantling the heavy synaptic architectures that bound you to your old life. As these physical neural connections snap and dissolve, they forcibly release the stored bioelectric signatures of unresolved trauma, repressed fears, and deeply outdated cultural conditioning directly into your active conscious awareness. This intense surfacing is the mandatory mechanism for final, irreversible processing. A biological exhaust system violently expelling the dense energy that can no longer be sustained by your rapidly upgrading neurological framework. It is precisely, molecularly similar to watching a massive, dense block of solid ice rapidly and violently boil into completely formless vapor in a matter of mere seconds. You are actively, physically experiencing the violent, chaotic, and terrifying structural breakdown of your own internal molecules, which are vibrating with uncontrollable speed as they are ruthlessly forced to transition from a dense, frozen, deeply protective state of matter into a completely new, fundamentally expansive, and highly energetic phase of existence. As this profound biological turbulence reaches its terrifying peak, your panicked ego instinctively attempts to aggressively regain control of the situation by forcefully planning your next week, desperately trying to logically figure out the next sequential step in your career or your overarching life trajectory. But your deeply exhausted mind simply, flatly refuses to construct a coherent sequence of chronological events. You open your digital calendar or stare desperately at a blank page in a notebook, and you realize that the harder you try to forcefully organize your fragmented thoughts, the more profoundly confused, disoriented, and deeply mentally exhausted you immediately become. You attempt to strictly project a timeline, to carefully predict the future based on the reliable historical data of your past experiences, but the cognitive effort required feels completely futile, draining massive amounts of energy while yielding absolutely zero clarity. It leaves you with the distinct maddening sensation that you are frantically trying to tightly grasp freezing, flowing water with your bare hands, watching it slip effortlessly through your fingers, no matter how hard you squeeze. You slowly realize with a creeping, undeniable sense of existential dread that your standard, highly reliable, previously celebrated problem-solving mechanisms are completely, fundamentally, and entirely broken. You simply cannot think your way out of this transitional phase, and this absolute failure of standard cognition forces you into a deeply uncomfortable, ego-shattering surrender to the vast, formless, and terrifyingly silent unknown. This sudden cognitive paralysis is absolutely not a sign of declining intelligence, and it is not a symptom of permanent, unfixable brain fog. The left hemisphere of your brain, the specific, highly localized neurological region that strictly and exclusively governs linear sequencing, historical data analysis, time-bound perception, and deterministic logic, is being deliberately, chemically, and temporarily suppressed by your own advanced central nervous system. Your biology is actively and intelligently preventing you from accessing and utilizing your old logical frameworks. It is doing this because allowing you to use your historical logic right now would mathematically guarantee the exact, precise recreation of your past limitations and your previous suffering within your new, rapidly emerging timeline. This forced, terrifying cognitive surrender is a highly sophisticated biological failsafe designed to intentionally shift your neurological dominance away from the predictive, fear-based survival brain and entirely into the expansive right hemisphere. It forces the activation of the massive, completely untapped quantum processing capabilities of your heart-brain coherence. Your system is literally unplugging the localized linear computer to forcibly allow for vast, non-linear pattern recognition, granting your consciousness unprecedented access to infinite probability fields that are completely unconstrained by your painful historical data. Imagine a master, world-renowned architect standing at the absolute pinnacle of their career, deliberately and methodically throwing away all of their heavily detailed blueprints, snapping their precise measuring tapes, and burning their mathematical rulers. They are stepping onto a vast, bare, entirely uneven plot of untamed land with completely empty hands, aggressively refusing to force a rigid, preconceived geometry onto the organic space, and instead surrendering entirely to the environment, allowing the natural, hidden contours of the raw earth to seamlessly and perfectly dictate the breathtaking shape of the monumental new structure. You have officially, mathematically, and irreversibly reached a critical juncture where you physically, emotionally, and energetically cannot go back to who you used to be. The mere thought of returning to your old habits, your old social circles, or your old coping mechanisms physically repulses you. Yet you also have absolutely no conceptual idea, no visual image, and no logical understanding of who you are actually becoming or what your new daily life will realistically look like. You feel entirely suspended, floating weightlessly in a dark, formless, heavily silent hallway, perfectly positioned between massive, firmly closed steel doors. You are completely and entirely disconnected from the burning ambitions, the desperate attachments, and the complex relationships that loudly defined your past decades, yet you remain completely, terrifyingly blind to the landscape and the purpose of your rapidly approaching future. There is a strange, heavy, quiet terror that deeply permeates your waking days, intimately and paradoxically mixed with a profound, undeniable sense of sacred awe. You sit in the silence and slowly, undeniably realize that the entire foundation of your known reality, the very bedrock upon which you built your entire persona, has been completely, ruthlessly, and perfectly wiped clean. You currently exist in a temporary floating state of absolute unnerving neutrality, violently stripped of all the comforting illusions of your previous identity, simply waiting in the heavy, expectant darkness for a directional signal that has not yet logically arrived. In the highly precise mathematical language of advanced quantum mechanics, this terrifying silent hallway is the literal physical state of quantum superposition. It is the raw, unformed, chaotic space where all of your previous solidly collapsed probabilities and highly rigid life structures have dissolved completely and seamlessly back into the foundational, invisible wave function of pure, unmanifested, infinite potential. Biologically, deep within the hidden architecture of your physical body, your millions of stem cells and your highly adaptable neural progenitor cells are currently resting in a localized state of maximum, entirely unprecedented plasticity. They are wiped completely clean of their previous genetic and epigenetic instructions, floating suspended in the biological void, waiting patiently and attentively for a new, highly coherent, extremely powerful electromagnetic signal generated by your rapidly changing environment and your heavily focused consciousness. It is this specific, upcoming energetic frequency that will permanently and flawlessly instruct these blank biological slates on exactly how to configure the new, highly advanced biological tissues, the entirely new neural pathways, and the fundamentally new reality structures that will form the solid foundation of your next iteration. It perfectly biologically mirrors a struggling caterpillar that has completely, violently, and naturally liquefied inside the dark, highly restrictive, protective walls of its hanging chrysalis. It is existing temporarily, not as a functional insect, not as a recognizable entity, but solely as a highly active, incredibly chaotic, completely formless biological soup. It rests silently in the absolute darkness, vibrating with terrifying potential, merely waiting for the precise, mathematically perfect moment when the first microscopic, highly organized butterfly cells begin to rapidly, beautifully, and unstoppably organize the stunning, flight-capable architecture of its entirely new, fundamentally elevated existence. In the absolute center of this suffocating, inescapable exhaustion and the relentless mental fog that has paralyzed your life, a sudden, violently abrupt fracture appears in the dense architecture of your daily suffering. You are simply sitting in the middle of a room, perhaps staring blankly at a wall, entirely consumed by the heavy numbness that has become your default state, when a micro-moment of terrifying, piercing clarity forcefully rips through the psychological static. It happens without warning and without trigger. You suddenly inexplicably catch yourself watching your own thoughts spin out of control, observing the tight mechanical panic in your chest as if you are standing completely outside of your physical body. You feel a sudden, undeniable and permanent separation between the mechanical anxiety embedded in your tissues and a quiet, ancient, unshakable presence situated deep behind your eyes that remains completely undisturbed by the internal turbulence. It is a visceral, deeply physical shock to the biological system. You realize with a heavy, sinking sensation of profound truth that you are not the exhausted, desperate mind frantically trying to figure out its next logical move. You are not the dense, suffocating emotions actively dragging your physical body down into the mattress every single morning. And you are definitively not the terrified, looping voice in your head screaming that you are failing at life. You are the vast, infinite, silent space that is actively, passively containing every single one of those chaotic elements. The panic is still physically happening, the severe cognitive confusion is still raging across your synapses, but you are no longer the one drowning at the bottom of the ocean. You are the one quietly watching the storm happen from an unbreachable, elevated distance. This is not a clever psychological trick, a temporary coping mechanism, or a fleeting moment of dissociation from your painful reality. The complex neural networks directly connecting your highly evolved, executive functioning frontal lobe to the deep, primal feeling centers of the insular cortex are aggressively establishing an entirely new, heavily myelinated pathway of advanced metacognition. Your biological vessel is manually and deliberately decoupling your core conscious awareness from the automated ancient survival programming of the hyperactive amygdala. You are physically watching the harsh chemical reactions of fear fire off in your brain, but the electrical current of your true identity is no longer plugged into that specific, outdated circuit. You have successfully biologically activated the quantum observer. In the precise mathematical realm of quantum mechanics, a subatomic particle exists only as a chaotic, unpredictable wave of infinite, unmanifested probabilities until the exact, singular moment a localized point of pure awareness observes it directly. Your conscious, focused attention is the literal mechanism that collapses that chaotic swirling wave function into a dense, physical, measurable reality. By deliberately stepping back and simply watching the internal storm rage without attaching your identity to the lightning, your central nervous system is learning to operate entirely independent of the mechanical reactionary reflexes of your biological hardware. You are forcibly taking the wheel back from a panicked, trauma-informed autopilot system that has been driving you into the ground for decades. It is the exact, suffocating, and terrifying experience of being a heavily weighted deep sea diver, trapped helplessly in a violent, terrifying surface storm, completely battered and thrown by the crashing waves. Suddenly, the heavily weighted boots lock into place, and you drop heavily, rapidly, and decisively below the chaotic surface turbulence. You sink immediately into an environment of absolute, silent, unshakable, and pressurized stillness, while the hurricane continues to rage pointlessly, miles above your head. And in the crushing, absolute weight of that sudden, profound internal stillness, a massive, devastating wave of pure grief washes completely over you. It hits the center of your chest with the physical, undeniable force of a solid concrete wall, violently knocking the wind out of your lungs and bringing hot, unexplainable, stinging tears rushing rapidly to the surface of your eyes. You are not mourning the physical loss of a loved one, and you are not grieving a tragic external event that has occurred in your timeline. You are actively mourning the definitive, irreversible, and permanent loss of the specific version of yourself that you are actively leaving behind in this exact, agonizing moment of transition. You are sitting quietly, silently attending your own internal funeral. You suddenly recognize, with an absolute, terrifying and razor-sharp clarity, that the highly effective, fiercely protective coping mechanisms that successfully kept you safe for decades are now completely, entirely obsolete. The heavily guarded defensive personality traits that protected you from perceived rejection, the relentless overachieving that brilliantly masked your deep insecurity, and the superficial social dynamics that constantly validated your fragile ego, must now be discarded entirely and without hesitation, Saying a final goodbye to these deeply ingrained survival tactics feels intensely, physically painful, exactly as if you are deliberately and slowly amputating a phantom limb that you still feel vividly and rely on for balance. You are feeling the heavy, somatic, muscular release of letting your old, constructed identity die completely, violently stripping away the heavy iron armor that has ultimately become far heavier and more dangerous than the external threats it was originally designed to stop. This heavy, weeping psychological mourning is not a clinical sign of depression or a regression in your healing journey. It is a highly calculated, violently necessary, and perfectly orchestrated biological purge. The intense, racking grief intentionally triggers a massive, systemic, and overwhelming release of profound neurochemicals, heavily flooding your central nervous system with incredibly high doses of binding oxytocin and deep-acting, pain-killing endorphins. This specific targeted neurochemical cocktail acts as a highly potent biological solvent, actively dissolving, breaking down, and rapidly flushing out the dense, toxic, stored neuropeptides strictly associated with your previous, prolonged states of chronic baseline stress and hypervigilant defense. The painful, undeniable symbolic death you are currently feeling in your bones is a literal, microscopic, and relentless program of cellular apoptosis initiated directly by your newly upgraded central nervous system. Your biology is systematically, ruthlessly, and methodically dismantling the complex, interwoven synaptic architectures that historically housed your deeply limiting beliefs and your fiercely protected survival-based ego constructs. It is actively and intentionally starving these old, heavily used neural pathways of vital metabolic energy, ensuring with absolute, cold biological finality that they can never again secure the resources to parasitize the new, elevated energy baseline you are currently constructing in the dark. The profound grief is simply the physical echoing sensation of millions of microscopic, outdated bridges violently collapsing inside the architecture of your brain. Think of a massive, ancient, dying star that has completely and utterly exhausted its core nuclear fuel, violently and rapidly collapsing inward under the crushing, inescapable weight of its own immense, terrifying gravity. It relentlessly crushes its old, dense, recognizable elemental structure into a state of absolute, silent, blinding darkness for a fraction of a millisecond, completely destroying its former shape. Just a moment later, it detonates violently outward into a brilliant, entirely new and spectacularly universe-altering supernova. Immediately following the heavy, exhaustive, and physically draining grief of completely releasing your grip on your old self, the dense, heavy atmospheric pressure in the room suddenly, inexplicably shifts. You suddenly detect a strange, undeniable, and highly specific frequency of subtle, electric excitement humming intensely and persistently just beneath the surface of your skin. Your external, visible circumstances have not changed in the slightest possible way. You still have absolutely no logical step-by-step plan. Your bank account looks exactly the same as it did yesterday, and your immediate future remains completely, entirely obscured by the thick, impenetrable fog of the great unknown. Yet, despite the total lack of external validation or logical proof, you feel an inexplicable, unshakable, and deeply rooted sense of profound, permanent safety. There is a deep, resonant, and incredibly loud inner knowing vibrating directly in your bones that something massive, something incredibly powerful, and something vastly superior is actively arranging itself in your favor behind the invisible scenes of your reality. The terrifying, pitch-black void that previously felt like an endless, empty, and highly dangerous abyss of failure no longer feels empty at all. It suddenly feels incredibly dense, highly electric, and violently vibrating with infinite, unseen, and fiercely unmanifested possibilities. The paralyzing fear of the unknown is instantly and completely replaced by a deep, quiet, and reverent awe of the raw, unshaped potential actively surrounding your physical body. You are standing perfectly still in the blank, formless, unwritten space directly between two distinctly different realities, and you can literally, physically feel the raw fabric of an entirely new, elevated timeline actively weaving its complex patterns together in the dark. By entirely completely ceasing all of your frantic, panicked and exhausting resistance, you have successfully achieved the biological impossible. You have allowed the complete, unhindered, and devastating dissolution of your old restrictive and heavily guarded neural structures, and in doing so, you have successfully lowered the chaotic, destructive, and highly inefficient entropy of your internal biological state. You have completely stopped fighting the overwhelming current of the river. This profound, total act of cellular surrender forcefully commands your heart to generate a massively coherent, highly organized, and mathematically perfect electromagnetic field that powerfully extends far beyond the physical boundaries of your skin and bones. This newly coherent, deeply stabilized biological field is not a vague, esoteric, or metaphysical concept. It is a highly measurable, intensely powerful, and undeniable energetic magnet. In the fluid, responsive quantum field, your highly focused, steadily elevated emotional frequency is actively, aggressively collapsing the highest, most optimized, and most mathematically beautiful probability wave functions directly into dense, physical reality. Your biology is now powerfully broadcasting a pristine, entirely interference-free electromagnetic signal that is forcefully beginning the rapid, almost aggressive materialization of physical circumstances, seemingly impossible synchronicities, and highly specific opportunities that perfectly and flawlessly match your newly elevated internal frequency. You are no longer desperately, exhaustingly chasing reality, but instead, you are magnetically, effortlessly pulling it directly toward your new, stabilized center of gravity. Imagine a scorched, completely blackened, and seemingly ruined forest floor in the immediate, deeply silent aftermath of a massive, devastating, and violently hot wildfire. To the untrained, logical eye, the charred landscape appears completely dead, utterly destroyed, and permanently reduced to nothing but gray ash and barren, ruined earth. But just millimeters beneath the surface of the blackened soil, the ground is fiercely, intensely vibrating with millions of highly specialized, heat-activated seeds that have been waiting patiently for decades for this exact, highly necessary, and fiercely destructive fire, preparing to erupt simultaneously into an entirely new, impossibly vibrant, and deeply, permanently resilient ecosystem. Just as you begin to feel the faintest trace of this new energy attempting to stabilize within your physical architecture, your mind suddenly initiates an absolute, terrifying rebellion. It is a violent and completely unexpected spike of sheer panic that rips through your chest, bombarding your conscious awareness with intense, blinding fears about your money, your vanishing time, and your perceived social status. You feel a massive, desperate, almost uncontrollable somatic urge to abruptly intervene in the process, to hustle aggressively, or to force some kind of immediate, tangible outcome just to prove to yourself that you are still holding the reins of your own existence. Every single fiber of your biological vessel is screaming at you to immediately abandon this terrifying void, demanding that you frantically grab onto the crumbling, jagged rocks of your old life, instead of trusting the silent momentum of the fall. You are standing on the sharp, terrifying edge of a psychological cliff, looking down into an abyss that your ego perceives as absolute annihilation. This sudden and overwhelming return of anxiety is not a sign that you have failed, or that your old reality is somehow reclaiming its dominance over your future. It is a highly specific, well-documented neurological phenomenon known as an extinction burst, which occurs at the exact moment a deeply ingrained behavioral loop realizes it is about to be permanently eradicated. The dying neural networks that used to govern your stress responses and your survival mechanisms are now firing with maximum, desperate intensity, launching a massive internal assault in a final, frantic attempt to secure the bioelectric resources they desperately need to survive. These starving synaptic pathways are intentionally flooding your bloodstream with extreme chemical signals, attempting to trick your conscious mind into generating the familiar, chaotic frequencies of fear that once kept them fully powered. They are fighting for their very existence, weaponizing your deepest insecurities to drag you back into the neurological basement. If you react to this synthetic fear and engage in forced, stress-based action, You immediately activate the sympathetic nervous system, violently interrupting the delicate remodeling process occurring deep within your cellular structure. This panic-induced reaction instantly floods your body with cortisol and adrenaline, forcing your brainwaves out of the expansive, coherent states of creation and slamming them directly back into the rigid beta wave frequencies of baseline survival. By abruptly taking action from a place of terror, you are mathematically collapsing the vast, infinite quantum probability of your new timeline straight back into the dense, highly deterministic, and thoroughly exhausted outcomes of your past. You are effectively aborting the systemic upgrade in its final stages, feeding the dying strange attractor the exact electromagnetic currency it requires to rebuild its prison around your awareness. It is exactly like a malicious computer virus throwing every single corrupted file and screaming warning banner onto your screen at the exact same time, desperately trying to trick you into panicking and manually cancelling the final crucial seconds of a massive antivirus deep clean protocol. Instead of falling for the illusion of the panic, you make the radically unnatural and supremely courageous decision to take a deep, slow breath and do absolutely nothing in response to the fear. You consciously choose to lean back into the intense physical heaviness, watching the internal alarms ring violently without moving a single muscle to silence them, surrendering your entire being to the chaotic friction of the transition. This is the ultimate test of your neurological resolve, requiring you to sit completely still while your ego screams that the building is on fire, trusting the invisible architecture of the void more than the tangible panic of your own flesh. You allow the anxiety to wash over you without attaching any narrative to it, observing the chemical storm from the silent, unshakable seat of the quantum observer. You refuse to touch the controls. The moment you completely detach your awareness from the manufactured urgency of the mind, you feel a sudden, massive wave of profound physical relief begin to wash down your spine. The deep, chronic tension that has been locked in your jaw, your neck, and your shoulders for decades suddenly melts away, as if heavy, invisible chains have finally snapped, allowing your breathing to deepen significantly and effortlessly. By actively refusing to engage the stress response, you manually override the ancient survival programming of the amygdala and aggressively stimulate the vagus nerve, sending a powerful biological signal of absolute safety throughout your entire biological network. You are forcing the nervous system completely out of its sympathetic dominance and dropping it heavily into a state of profound parasympathetic rest, repair, and deep integration. This absolute biological surrender creates a state of maximum neurological plasticity, softening the rigid tissues of the brain and the body so that the new energetic blueprint can finally take physical form. The newly forming synaptic connections and the vastly higher frequency electromagnetic baseline are now able to literally lock into the physical tissues of your nervous system without the highly disruptive, static interference of stress hormones. Your cellular memory is being completely rewritten in real time, permanently replacing the archaic codes of struggle and defense with the sophisticated, streamlined algorithms of effortless expansion and deep systemic trust. You are anchoring the ethereal mathematics of your new timeline directly into the dense biology of your human vessel, solidifying the bridge between the quantum field and the physical world. Imagine a massive airplane descending through an extreme, violently shaking system of dark storm clouds, completely blind to the earth below. The pilot, instead of violently wrestling with the yoke in a state of sheer panic, completely takes their hands off the controls, trusting the immensely advanced, highly precise autopilot system to safely guide the massive machine perfectly onto the hidden runway. You wake up one morning and instantly realize that the dense, oppressive gravity that has relentlessly anchored you to the mattress for weeks has completely vanished without a trace. It has been entirely replaced by a clean, quiet, and endlessly sustainable energy that hums softly beneath your skin, a frictionless vitality that does not require any caffeine, motivation, or psychological force to maintain. Your mind feels unbelievably sharp and exceptionally clear, stripped of the constant, exhausting background noise of doubt and hesitation, while your physical body feels incredibly light, moving through the world with a fluid, effortless grace. You suddenly know exactly what your very next step is without having to overthink, analyze, or strategize at all, experiencing a seamless, frictionless flow of direct inspiration that translates immediately into precise, perfectly timed action. You look at your life, your past and your future with a deep, utterly unbreakable sense of calm. You realize with absolute, unwavering certainty that you have successfully crossed the bridge and locked permanently into an entirely new, vastly higher frequency version of reality. The profound biological bifurcation is now complete, and the intensely complex mathematical system of your mind and body has successfully stabilized around a completely new, higher-order strange attractor. The old, decaying orbit of survival and struggle has been fundamentally annihilated, and your conscious awareness is now resting effortlessly within the center of a highly coherent, intensely magnetic geometric structure of pure potential. Your central nervous system is currently operating at a vastly increased, almost superhuman level of quantum coherence, functioning as a flawless, hyperconductive antenna for the transmission and reception of elevated frequencies. You are effortlessly processing reality through advanced, newly crystallized neural networks that inherently support a state of continuous flow, heightened intuition, and the absolute absence of internal resistance. This profound systemic coherence allows for the rapid, continuous, and almost magical materialization of physical outcomes that are perfectly aligned with your upgraded electromagnetic signature, bending the fabric of reality to match your new baseline. The environment around you begins to morph and arrange itself with astonishing speed and precision, delivering the exact resources, people, and opportunities required to sustain your new trajectory, entirely bypassing the dense, linear pathways of conventional effort. You are no longer chasing reality from a place of lack, but actively commanding it through the sheer, resonant power of your fully stabilized presence. It is the exact breathtaking moment an intensely massive, wildly complex jigsaw puzzle suddenly clicks together perfectly, where thousands of chaotic, fragmented, individual pieces instantly vanish into a single, flawlessly unified and deeply magnificent image.